Hi everyone, thanks for joining us this evening for our webinar focusing on opportunities for emergency doctors working with MSF projects. I would like, and we would like as MSF Australia, to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians upon the lands where I am today. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to pay my respects, our respect, to their elders past, present and future. For they hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, peoples of Australia. In recognition that we're a binational association, I would also like to take the opportunity to salute our colleagues joining from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Hi everyone, I'm a Field HR Recruitment and Training Officer here at MSF Australia, and tonight I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jared O'Reilly, ASIM Global Emergency Care Committee representative. Hi Jared.
Hi Jody, thanks for having me on board this evening. It's a great privilege to join this joint session with ASIM and MSF. I was the inaugural chair of the ASIM Global Emergency Care Committee. I'm still a member of that committee, and once upon a time was a veteran with the MSF. I had the privilege of spending a mission in North Afghanistan in Faryab province, and about 50 kilometres from the front line at the time, as it was, and subsequently at what was for a long time the largest refugee camp in the world, which is in Dadaab in Kenya. So I have fond memories of my time with MSF, and I look forward to this evening.
Thanks very much, Gerard. It's certainly great to have this partnership with ASIM this evening. So the webinar today is an opportunity for emergency fellows and trainees to hear some information about emergency care placements with MSF, and also to hear about our recruitment processes. In MSF projects around the world, there are urgent needs for emergency professionals. ED roles are most often required in conflict and unstable areas such as Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Gaza and Palestine, as well as specialist COVID projects. If you're an ED consultant, for a placement with MSF, you need to be available for 6 weeks in the field. This does not include travel there and back or any quarantine time. Ideally, we'd like you to be available for up to 4 months. If you're an ED trainee, for your first placement, you must be available for 9 months. Whether your mission is 6 months or not, you need to be available for 9 months. And to take up an ED role, you need to have completed 3 years of training. Today, we're joined by field workers, returned field workers who are also ASIM trainees, Dr. Kate Goulding and Dr. Pete Saunders. Hi Kate, hi Pete. We'll have time at the end of our conversation for questions, so please send through any on the MSF website, YouTube or Facebook as we go. Please note we can't respond to any individual suitability questions online. All right, I'll hand over to you, Gerard, to hear about life and work in the field with Kate and Pete. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jody. Hi, Kate, and hi, Pete. Perhaps to start with, can you tell a bit about yourself, your current role, and what made you originally decide to work with MSF? Kate.
Thanks, Jared. I am currently an advanced trainee working at Liverpool Hospital in Sydney. At the time that I signed up with MSF, I was working at the hospital in Alice Springs, and it was working in a slightly lower resource department in a different setting that kind of prompted my interest in working abroad.
Pete?
Yeah, I'm an advanced trainee in emergency medicine as well. I've done 2 missions with MSF. The first one in 2019 I went to South Sudan, and the second mission earlier this year went to Afghanistan. What made me want to work with MSF was, I guess, their focus on providing medical care in the humanitarian sector. And yeah, I've been part of MSF. I know they do a really good job in this area. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, but they do a really good job.
So Pete, can you tell us a bit more about each of those 2 missions that you were exposed to?
Yeah, each mission is can be very different, but also have sort of some similarities with challenges. MSF work in this they are and what they do. They go to the areas that often many other people sort of don't venture into. My first mission was in Lankan in South Sudan. It was a bit of I guess, a classical picture in that it's kind of in the middle of Africa. You're in the sort of almost feels like the middle of nowhere. You get sort of dropped out there by a helicopter, surrounded by sort of food packages and sort of that sort of thing. You land in a dirt paddock with a bunch of cows scatter out of the way, and sort of worked out of a mud hut really. But MSF had a hospital out there and served the people. Quite a lot of people out there, really quite dependent on the health services. And my role out there was as basically a medical doctor, but it ranged anything from when people present into the emergency room all the way through their admission and hopefully discharge back into the community, and also helping out in the inpatient therapeutic feeding centre. Other thing, when I went to Herat, the role was much more specific. That was a COVID treatment hospital where MSF had agreed with the local Ministry of Health to help them in sort of dealing with an outbreak of COVID in Herat.
Sounds like things haven't changed too much in 20 years, like a Survivor reality TV show arriving in South Sudan. So that sounds fascinating. Kate, what was your experience in Iraq, or what was your mission in particular?
I was working in Sununi, which is along the northwestern border of Iraq with Syria, with the Yazidi population there. And the role of the project in that area at the time was helping to rebuild the medical system, both structurally and in terms of personnel. About 5 years earlier, ISIS had been through and perpetrated a genocide against the community there and destroyed a lot of the structures. So that was what I was doing there. It wasn't mud huts for me. I was in very nice accommodation with air conditioning and that kind of thing. But I mean, we were 3 hours away from the nearest city. We would get in a van to drive out to the hospital and pass through 17 or so checkpoints, military checkpoints, to get to the hospital. I was quite lucky. The project I was in was relatively low security most of the time I was there, so I could walk to and from work a few blocks each day and go down the street and get falafel at lunchtime and that kind of thing. And then in terms of what I was actually doing in the project, you have to be quite flexible. I think when I was sent out there, I was meant to be an emergency doctor finished, and instead what I ended up doing was I arrived in Geneva and was told that the pediatrician had just left the project and they hadn't found a replacement yet, and arrived at the project and was told that 6 days later the psychiatrist was leaving. So I sort of bounced back and forward between each of those jobs each day.
What did your day look like from start to finish at work, Kate?
I would usually head off to work sometime between 7 and 8 in the morning and touch base with the guys in the emergency department to see if there'd been any issues overnight. And then I would often do a ward round on the pediatric and neonatal ward, and spend most of the rest of my day on call just to support doctors and nurses working in both of those departments. And getting involved only when necessary in terms of more severe cases or when there was a teaching opportunity or something like that. I also did a lot of human resource management in terms of rostering and staffing, and a lot of medicine support for the mental health team. So I would supervise the distribution of medications and do mental health assessments while the psychiatrist wasn't there. You had to be sort of on the ball in terms of what was going on with your resources and that kind of thing, because I would be one of the steps to getting a patient out of the hospital. So the staff would call me and speak to me about a patient in terms of whether or not I thought they needed to be transferred into Kurdistan. And then that would obviously entail a lot of other security measures through higher up in my project. And then of course there was just, the nicer, more sort of what felt like mundane, but very good for building relationships in the project in terms of education.
And you, Pete, you had the 2 missions, but what did the day look like at work?
Yeah, each I think each location is going to be a bit different in terms of what your day looks like. In South Sudan in particular, the physical sort of challenges of living out in those sort of remote areas is a big part of your day, really, sort of navigating that. So in the morning, you put your gumboots on and sometimes slosh through the mud and get covered in flies, and that's your welcome in the morning coming out of your hut. And then after that, it would be, breakfast with the expats and then going off to work, and you do ward rounds, a lot of teaching, a lot of sort of oversight of the local doctors as well. In South Sudan, there was quite a lot of clinical work, so the majority of my time was actually spent doing really quite interesting clinical work. And I think that's one of the great things about MSF. You see such amazing pathologies, and sometimes you're very resource limited. And as sort of a doctor, a lot of times we enjoy those challenges, trying to work out what's going on with these people and trying to practice some safe and best medicine with what you have. After sort of in Herat though, quite comfortable conditions, living in big double bed and your own ensuite and things like that. The day looks a little bit different in that you're comfortable, but when you're driving to work, it's actually a lot more dangerous on the road. But when you're in the hospital, again, ward rounds, sometimes we're in the COVID clinic, so we'd spend up to 5 hours in the red zone sometimes. So it's a different kind of challenge, but often you get used to being uncomfortable. My first couple of days in the red zone, I'd coming from Australia where I hadn't really seen any COVID. After half an hour, I was ready to get out of there. I was too hot, too uncomfortable that the goggle straps are pulling your hair and you can't see out of the goggles. And 2 weeks later, you're 5 hours in the red zone. You're still a bit uncomfortable, but you adapt, and that's one of the challenges and one of the really rewarding things about working in the field.
And how did your ED training prepare you for that setting, or working with either of those missions with MSF? Or did it prepare you in any way?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the best things about emergency training is it helps you be adaptable. And with MSF, it is one of the big things. You need to be adaptable. Once you're out in the field, challenges that are very unforeseen sometimes will come up. And you might not have seen a lot of the pathology. For example, in South Sudan, I hadn't dealt with gunshot wounds, like many gunshot wounds, and all of a sudden you're dealing with lots of gunshot wounds. So you have to be able to adapt. Same thing with the COVID hospital, really. I hadn't seen any COVID, but emergency training helps you just develop that systematic thinking of trying to practice safe medicine and also consider the best ways of doing things. So I feel like emergency training was set me up really well to sort of adapt in those situations.
Thanks, Pete. And was that your experience, Kate? I know you had to work across paediatrics and mental health at short notice, but did you find that the ED background helped?
Yeah, I don't think I would have been able to do or manage with at least the first few weeks, but the whole project had I not been an emergency trainee. Like, I think we're all ASIM trainees are really lucky in that we do get exposed to lots of different aspects of medicine. I think that's, jack of all trades in the emergency department. And so, when I showed up on my first day in the project and went from having to check someone's ECG to managing a baby on the pediatric ward with severe bronchiolitis and no high flow, and then having to get called over to the maternity ward because they had a preterm labour with no antenatal care and they wanted help trying to figure out, how far along this baby was and were we going to resuscitate it if it wasn't breathing when it came out, and figuring out for the first time in my life how to measure a female ultrasound at 10 o'clock at night was, we wouldn't have known how to do that had we not been trained as emergency physicians, I think. And certainly, being an early advanced trainee and having to manage departments in Australia overnight definitely gave me the basis for being able to manage multiple teams across multiple wards whilst I was in Iraq. And I think the time that I've spent with MSF has managed to, helped me build on that and taken me above and beyond, so that now, managing or overseeing the Liverpool emergency department on a Friday or Saturday night doesn't seem quite so overwhelming.
So your MSF experience, you've been able to bring something of great value back to your own ED, is what you're saying?
Yeah, without a doubt. Like, I mean, I think that working in Iraq was probably, working with MSF made me realize what I was capable of. And it really puts a lot of things that we do here into perspective and makes work here in general a lot more enjoyable, because we've got this abundance of resources and we work with multiple members in a team at all times of day and night most often. And I think, you know, having that, having to deal with such a huge variety of things in such a limited resource setting whilst away really just changes the way you think about things and makes you back yourself when you're managing stuff here in the middle of the night.
Did you find the same, Pete? And were there examples when you've come back that it's actually been hard to practice in a higher resource setting? Was that a challenge?
Yeah, I think so. Often people in those settings can be really quite aware of the help that you're providing to them, and that's obviously one challenge when you come back, and that's a little bit lost on our society sometimes. So that can be a challenge that I think a lot of people find difficult when they initially get back. But I think that usually passes after a little while. It doesn't sort of jade you for life, that kind of thing. Most people just get on with the job, and I think working in the field, the skill set is definitely one of the big challenges. We're really quite blessed here with the amazing skill set of everybody, from the person that first sees the patient when they walk through the door to just nursing staff, who are maintenance people, everybody is just super skilled here. And when you're in the field, that's definitely one of the big challenges, but it helps you really appreciate the skill set of everybody back home as well, which is quite nice.
Pretty wonderful.
You mentioned South Sudan was pretty, sorry, Kate.
No, sorry, I was going to say it's pretty wonderful though to see the difference between when you arrive and when you leave, I think, in terms of that skill set that you're working with. I thought that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's great to be, very privileged to be in that mentoring role. In South Sudan, Pete, you were in pretty close quarters. How did that go with the expat team?
Yeah, in working and living with people that you've from all over the world, living so close with them, often in very difficult, well, in that particular setting, quite a difficult physical setting. There can be some conflict, and that is something that people need to prepare themselves for. When I first arrived, there was already there was a bit of conflict going on between the expats, and it can make work a little bit more challenging for sure. In Herat in Afghanistan, it was kind of the opposite. When I got there, everyone was, really clicking and getting along, and it stayed that way the whole time I was there. So it definitely makes things easier from that point of view. So yeah, that is something people need to be prepared for, to be able to have those interpersonal skills and coping mechanisms for if everybody's not getting along so well at times, and just find ways to make it work.
And the little downtime you had, Kate, particularly in the first month or two, how did you manage whatever downtime you had? What was your approach?
You would come home from work and you would try and eat meals with the family or with the house while you were there. And I had a couple of closer mates in my house that at least a couple of times a week we would sort of scurry off down to the basement and try and do some yoga or something like that. Which I think it's really valuable, being able to have that kind of hobby that you can do in an enclosed space, because you really don't know what the security in your project is going to be like from one day to the next. I was quite lucky, as I said, I was able to go out a little bit, and there were safe areas in my town that I was allowed to go to after hours, as long as I was with other MSF staff. So I unfortunately took up the bad habit of smoking shisha while I was away, which I think is really important, to spend that time with guys outside of the project or outside of work, because it's the same as here in Australia, right? Your friends and your colleagues end up being one and the same, and it strengthens your work relationship, and that teamwork in a stressful situation doesn't seem quite so stressful anymore.
And have you found a shisha haunt back near Liverpool Hospital?
I was spending a bit of time asking the patients when I first came here and just kept getting invitations to people's backyards. It's been a very good way to stop smoking. There's nothing good here.
So, Kate, would you like to go back at some stage or do another mission with MSF?
Yeah, without a doubt. I would have gone back already, but my plan at the moment is to try and get through my fellowship, and then it'll be my little reward at the end. Go away again.
Pete, what about you?
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat as Kate there. MSF's they're a really good organisation to work with. They're quite transparent and they're actually quite flexible themselves. Yeah, so definitely want to be involved in the future, yeah.
Okay, and just a word to finish, and you've probably covered this to some extent, but I'm interested in life's lessons learned, Pete, in the field. How were you different in a better way when you came back from the field with MSF?
I think you definitely improve as your professionalism and your sort of ability to supervise and train other staff definitely improves. That's one of the long-lasting effects you want to leave. For example, when we got there, running through something like advanced life support with their doctors, it was still a bit kind of all over the place and lost to them. And 2 months later, we had the doctors teaching other doctors how to do it, and things like that are quite satisfying. So it really is helpful in that kind of maturing sort of aspect of your job. Yeah.
It's great. And Kate, what was a life's lesson for you, or the thing that really stuck with you ever since?
I think Pete's right. Like the teaching and education that you can do in those projects and the difference that you can make with a little bit of effort in something like advanced life support really is important. For me, I think it was the friendships that I made with the expats and the national staff, in terms of, I still get messages from the guys that I was working with in Iraq every now and again, and that's pretty wonderful.
And finally, your favourite food from Iraq?
I mean, I can't choose. Basically anything that goes with shisha.
Okay, shisha's the food then. Pete, what about in South Sudan and Afghanistan?
Sorry for the vegetarians, but sometimes we'd buy a goat locally. That was always pretty good. And in Afghanistan, they actually had one of the best cooks in MSF, they said, when I was going there. And when I got there, they weren't kidding. He was amazing.
Found him in Iraq.
Great.
Yeah, he had all the repertoire.
It's been a privilege talking to both of you about your experiences. It's fascinating and fantastic and challenging times you had, but you've made the most of it, and I'm sure you've contributed heaps. So thank you very much, and back to you, Jodie.
Thanks very much, Gerard. Thanks very much, Kate. Thanks, Pete. Yeah, so if that's sounded very interesting to you and sparked your interest, please head to our website to read more. Criteria for emergency doctors is outlined on the website. You are required to be an emergency medicine specialist who's completed their training in an accredited emergency medicine specialty training program. You need experience managing in an emergency department, ability to supervise and lead an emergency department, and ability to work for 6 weeks in the field. So as I said, that's not a comprehensive list. You can find all the details on our website. So to apply to MSF, you need to complete an application form online and a skills assessment. Once that's done and we receive your application, they'll be technically assessed. And if you meet the criteria, we'll then invite you to interview. If you've had a successful interview, there are a few other recruitment processes, including reference checks, police and medical checks, and successful completion of the MSF Welcome Days course. Our next MSF Welcome Days courses are in June and October 2021. Once you're officially recruited to the pool of field workers, it may be some time before you're actually matched and mobilised to a placement, because there's many variables, things like visas, etc. It's all dependent. However, being an emergency professional and the fact that these are current urgent needs, we would assume that you would be matched and placed within 6 months of completing the Welcome Days training. All the employment terms and conditions are on our website, including pay levels and leave. Just a note about working in COVID times. So MSF, since COVID started, we've managed to bring all field workers safely back home. So the biggest delay we had was about a month that it took for a field worker to return. MSF does its best to find options to return you safely to Australia or New Zealand. We cannot guarantee that travel will happen as we plan. The main reasons for delays are the limited number of people allowed to come into Australia and the quarantine booking in New Zealand and limited spots and flight availability. We've adopted a few strategies that have helped mitigate these issues, and MSF bear the cost of quarantine. If you've not yet received your quarantine vaccination, MSF's unable to get you further up the vaccination schedule. Whilst we've formally requested humanitarian workers be prioritised, this has not been responded to yet, and we're unable to do anything. So now it's time for questions, and I can see there's a couple that have come through. So a question for you, Pete. What were some of the unexpected challenges you encountered during your assignments, like environmental factors and insects, etc.? You sort of touched on that.
Yeah, I think that's, for some people, that's probably quite a big issue. Some people are, and for anyone really, it can get quite uncomfortable. In South Sudan, for example, it's really hot and you're just sweating the whole time, and the flies are incredible. You can't escape them sometimes. So I think, yeah, environmentally, like depending on where you go, there's sort of challenges. In Afghanistan, it was really cold, and not too many. Because we were sort of in compounds the whole time, we didn't have to deal with the local dog packs too much, but they were pretty interesting. You drive through the streets and they'd have these 10 or 12 dogs being led, like these giant dogs, and just in the middle of the city. And you just see some incredible things when you're out in these places, and you never get to the bottom of it. You just see it and think that was strange and sort of keep moving on your way. And but yeah, you got to be prepared for those sorts of environmental issues for sure.
Kate, did you have many environmental issues?
In terms of creepy crawlies, we had scorpions in Iraq, and they actually were the kind that caused catecholamine storm in patients, which was very, very interesting to manage in, you know, a room in the desert somewhere. But what I found really astounding and was a real reality check for me was the sheer amount of rubbish that you come across when you're driving around parts of the Middle East. Like, I think, again, you know, a lot of the expats used to spend a lot of time complaining about it. And it's really important, I think, to understand the perspective of the country that you're living in. You know, the reason there was water bottles everywhere was because there was no clean water in the town that I was working in. So you get used to a completely different, you know, there's no recycling, because why would you spend money on a recycling project when there's no water or no electricity? You get very used to those kinds of changes, and it ends up being a little bit, I think, part of the culture shock on the way back into Australia as well, getting used to our much more privileged way of life.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And there's just another question to both of you, Kate and Pete, about what you enjoyed the most.
Do you want to start, Pete?
You definitely enjoy you enjoy the pathology for sure, from the medical side of things. Like, it's very interesting. You see some incredible things. You definitely, the other part of it is enjoying seeing these places and traveling through these areas, and then the other side of it is just meeting new people from all over the world and developing friendships. And like Kate said, you still keep in contact with these people. They're real friendships. You live with each other for months on end, and you sort of go through some pretty tough stuff together. So you develop some good friendships. And but between those sort of three things, it does make quite the experience. And I think that's one of the main draws, I think, for doing it. Working with things like working with MSF is that you get all these things. You got to face the challenges, but there's definitely those rewards there.
Thanks, Pete. Kate?
Yeah, I agree with Pete. I think for all the really terrible or horrific things that you might see while you're away, there's also these amazing clinical experiences, whether it be education with the staff and the changes that you see, or specific cases. For me, it was a 32-week-old baby that was born in our hospital and somehow managed to survive without, ever needing anything more than feeding and growing, and was with us for weeks while we taught mum how to breastfeed and bottle feed and do all the correct things to make sure that this baby was going to survive when it was big enough to go home. And I think then in terms of those friendships that Pete's talking about, it's amazing to keep hearing about what the people that you were working with were doing, both in the project and outside of the project. Just a couple of weeks ago, I got sent a picture of the same baby that I was just talking about from one of the boys who was working on the pediatric ward. And then last week, I found out that one of the guys I was working with has just gotten married. And it's nice to kind of know that their lives are moving forward as well, even just as ours are back here.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Kate and Pete. So that's all the time we have for questions right now. And before I wrap up, I just want to say on behalf of MSF, a big thanks to ASIM for partnering with MSF Australia this evening for this webinar, and to you, Gerard, for co-hosting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. It's a privilege.
And to Kate and Pete, just thank you so much for sharing your experiences this evening. And I hope that may have inspired some fellows or trainees watching tonight, that you might like to put up your hands, and we hope to receive your applications in the near future. So yeah, ASIM, Gerard, Kate, Pete, thanks very much, and everybody have a great night. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jody.
Thanks.